Zachary Taylor. Earlier this year in our series, we visited the grounds of the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, where we discussed Taylor's term with historian Elbert Smith and cemetery director Gary Peak. The program's a little over 2 hours and begins with a brief video biography.
He was a war hero, like Washington, Jackson, and Harrison before him. But unlike any of his White House predecessors, Zachary Taylor had never before held elected office. In fact, when the Whig Party nominated him in 1848, he had never voted in an election. A 40-year Army veteran with little formal schooling, Taylor didn't think of himself as presidential material, and from the start suspected that perhaps his political supporters were crazy.
The idea that I should become president seems to me too visionary to require a serious answer. It has never entered my head, nor is it likely to enter the head of any sane person.
But most voters considered his background perfect for a commander-in-chief. He had grown up on the edge of the western frontier, just east of Louisville, Kentucky. He didn't attend college. Military life beckoned instead. At 24, he received his first lieutenant's commission from President Jefferson, and 4 years later went on to distinguish himself in the War of 1812. In the years that followed, Taylor continued to build his reputation with several victories over frontier Indian tribes. His troops called him Old Rough and Ready, in part because of his rugged appearance in battle, when the aging general typically roamed the front in an old straw hat and linen waistcoat. His physique was also a bit less than commanding. He was barely 5'8", and his legs were so short that he sometimes needed help getting into the saddle. When he was in his early 60s, President Polk sent him to Mexico, where his victories in the Mexican-American War made him a hero overnight. He returned home in November of 1847, and the following June became the Whig nominee for president. The party didn't know where he stood on most issues, but sensing victory didn't particularly care. Though the candidate had his critics, an adoring public came through, electing Taylor and his running mate Millard Fillmore to office in November of 1848. The homey, unpretentious nature of the Taylor White House was highlighted by the spectacle of the general's favorite war horse, Old Whitey, out grazing on the lawn, where tourists regularly took hairs from his tail as souvenirs. Also, the president enjoyed wandering incognito among the shops and vegetable stands of downtown Washington, often stopping to chat anonymously with constituents. But Taylor's term had its share of tension. After taking office, the president found himself the unwitting star of a national balancing act as he sought to contain the crisis over slavery and whether it should extend to the new territories acquired from Mexico. As the situation gave way to talk of Southern secession, Taylor, himself the owner of some 130 slaves, was livid. A firm believer in the preservation of the Union, he threatened to hang as traitors all would-be secessionists. There was also the matter of his chronically ill First Lady, Margaret Smith Taylor, of whom this is believed to be a portrait, was a semi-invalid who, while in the White House, deferred all official duties to her married daughter, Betty. Weary after 40 years as an Army wife, she had prayed ardently for her husband's defeat and regarded his political ascent as
a plot to deprive me of his society and shorten his life by unnecessary care and responsibility.
As it turned out, Mrs. Taylor wasn't far from wrong. On July 4, 1850, after sitting through 2 hours of speeches at the site of the uncompleted Washington Monument, President Taylor returned to the White House for some refreshments. Traditional accounts say he partook of some iced milk and cherries. That evening, he became ill, most likely from food poisoning, and 5 days later, at the age of 65, he died. He had been president for a little over 16 months.
For more than half a century, during which kingdoms and empires have fallen, this union has stood unshaken. In my judgment, its dissolution would be the greatest of calamities. Upon its preservation must depend our own happiness and that of countless generations to come. Zachary Taylor.
Good morning. morning on this Memorial Day 1999. Our American Presidents series continues from the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. This is our 12th segment on our 41 presidents. Zachary Taylor was the 12th president, but the second to die in office just 9 years after William Henry Harrison had died in office. In fact, Harrison and James Garfield were the only presidents who served shorter terms than Zachary Taylor. Nearly 13,000 people are interred here. At the back of the cemetery is the Taylor family plot. Zachary Taylor and his wife Margaret are both buried here. Our guests today are Elbert Smith, author of the book The Presidencies of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. He's also Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland. Gary Peak is the director of the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery. He'll show us around in a few minutes. William Gist will tell us about Taylor's boyhood home, Springfield. Mr. Gist owns that house, which is just behind the cemetery. And we'll be joined by Clara Rising, a former professor at the University of Florida. Her suspicions about the death of Zachary Taylor a few years ago led to the exhumation of the former president's body. All of this over the next 2.5 hours, and as always, we invite you to join us with your questions and comments. 202-624-1111 if you are in the Eastern or Central time zone, 202-624-1115 for those of you watching in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Elbert Smith, you could have written about any of the presidents. What drew you to Zachary Taylor?
Well, I have to admit, it was the fact that a publisher wrote me a letter asking me to do it. So I didn't have to worry about getting it published, and it was a very profitable thing for me to do. Once I started, I enjoyed it very much. I had done 4 other books on the period, so I had a fairly good understanding of the period and just putting him in it. But I quickly learned a great many things about him, which greatly increased the respect that I had formerly had for him.
Talk a little bit about what you knew before your research and how your research may have changed your opinion of him.
Well, I'd done a biography of Senator Thomas Hart Benton, for example, who destroyed his own political career in Missouri trying to avoid the Civil War. I had done a book called The Death of Slavery, which covered the American history from 1837 to 65. Again, focusing on the causes and the coming of the war. I had done a biography of Francis Preston Blair, who was a presidential advisor, a behind-the-scenes wire puller in this period, who owned the house across the street from the White House, which is now a guest house. And they had done the book on the presidency of James Buchanan, so I knew the period very, very well. I had more or less accepted a long-held view by a lot of historians. Very dramatic, makes a good story, but it's not true at all, namely that Taylor opposed the Compromise of 1850 simply because he was jealous of Henry Clay, and then died just in time for Millard Fillmore to save the compromise. And that's quite inaccurate. And I came to like Taylor very much. He was very straightforward, he was totally honest, he knew where he wanted to go. He had a better understanding of the situation than most of his contemporaries. He never hesitated to stand up for what he thought was right. And the fact that he was a slaveholder, but he made it plain in letters to his former son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, that while he would fight for the South if necessary, he would defend the South, he would also defend the right of Northerners to criticize slavery. He said, in effect, they have just as much right to criticize it as we do to defend it. And he would be a president not of one section, that the North, East, South, and West all had equal rights, and he would defend the rights of all 4, of the entire nation, that he would be a president of the nation. In fact, he even said he wouldn't even be a president of just the Whig Party, which elected him, that he didn't want to be the president of one party. He wanted to be president of everybody. And I found him very easy to like.
We have 2.5 hours to talk about him and his life. Let's start back at the beginning. Tell us where he was born and what discrepancy there is about exactly where that may be in Virginia, one of a number of presidents born in Virginia.
Well, he was born in Virginia, but he grew up in northern Kentucky, near Louisville, near where we are now. One great discrepancy, his political opponents tried to make him out to be an ignorant, uneducated, backwoods general who came from nowhere and didn't know anything. is totally incorrect, and I've always had trouble understanding why so many historians picked it up and kept that kind of myth going. Actually, he came from very distinguished parentage. He and President James Madison had the same great-grandfather, who was a very wealthy member of the Virginia elite. His mother came from a very prominent family, the Struthers family. Through her, he was descended from two leading people who came on the Mayflower, so that he had a very distinguished heritage. And his father was, in fact, reasonably wealthy. He had a big plantation. It's true he had very little formal schooling, and we can only speculate on this, but I have to believe that he probably had private tutors, because he wrote very well. He had a very strong vocabulary, and he had a very strong understanding of what was going on. He was criticized then, and now, of course, he never voted, but that's primarily because he was usually out on a wild frontier somewhere, defending settlers against the Indians, or in many cases, defending Indians against the settlers, which was another reason I liked old Taylor, because he believed that the United States government should honor its treaties. And if the government said, okay, the Indians can keep this amount of land, he was ready to burn the houses of white settlers who got on it. So he was never very popular with the white settlers. He believed again that if the United States made a deal, it should stick by it. And he was furiously angry at his cousin, President James Madison, because Madison wouldn't back him up on this. He wrote some very strong language to both Madison and the Secretary of War on this.
Before we take that first call, we had seen a map earlier noting in Orange County, Virginia, is where the state of Virginia says he was born. We have some footage of that birthplace. What can you tell us about the circumstances of his birth?
Not much. I just sort of took it for granted that to me, that wasn't very important. He was born in Virginia. He moved to Kentucky, where his father became a civic leader. His father was a state legislator, held various minor government jobs, and succeeded in politics and economically, so that I can't tell you much about that controversy.
As we continue to look at this footage from the Taylor birthplace at Montebello, which is in Orange County, Virginia, our first call is from Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Good morning. The reason I'm calling is a couple years ago, my father gave me a page from a puzzle magazine that says that James Polk ended his presidency on midnight, March 3rd, 1849, but that Zachary Taylor, his successor, was Episcopalian and refused to be sworn in on Sunday, March 4th, so that there was a gap for one day in the presidents, and that at that time, according to the law, David Rice Atchison, who was President pro tem of the Senate, was automatically president for one day. I'd like to know, is that true? And if it is, where could I find more information about that man?
About Atchison? You want more information
Yes.
about Atchison? The story is reasonably, it's true technically, although if any kind of crisis had come up, if a presidential decision had to be made, I'm quite certain they would have sworn Taylor in on the spot, and he would have made the decision.
What did he look?
It was strictly an honorary title if Atchison.
What did Zachary Taylor look like?
Well, he was very rugged looking. He was not unattractive. His wife absolutely adored him. In fact, she made them open the casket 3 times before they buried him so she could have one more look. His children loved him dearly. He had a very strong appearance. He wasn't handsome. He lost a lot of his hair, but we won't hold that against him. He inspired respect. His troops respected him, and he was a man, he was an extremely self-confident, well-adjusted person. I'm getting away from this lady's question, but...
What did he sound like?
Well, he obviously had a strong voice. And in battle, he was a great battlefield commander. He would race from one gun to another and was constantly exhorting his troops. He was a cheerleader type general who exposed himself, who was always in great danger. It's a wonder he didn't get killed, or at least seriously wounded. One story illustrates this kind of self-confidence he had. Well, the fact that he didn't think that he needed a fancy uniform. and that he was perfectly willing to run around out there with an old hat on and sometimes one epaulet missing and so on. And one story illustrates this. The Army had a practice in those years. It was called wooling. If an inspecting officer would go down the line and checking on soldiers, and if he didn't like something he saw, he would grab the soldier by the ears and shake him. And one day he had a young German recruit who had not been advised of this custom, a very large young man, and a sailor walked up to him and looked him over and grabbed him by the ears, and he knocked the general flat on his back. And Taylor's officers all said, well, we've got to shoot him. And you can't let him get away with that. If the troops can see a private knocking a general flat on his back and getting away with it, you'll never be able to command again. Taylor said, don't be ridiculous. Said, this man will be one of the best soldiers we'll get. He said, I like that in a man, you see. And Taylor was right. The story spread all through the Army, and it greatly enhanced the soldiers' respect for Taylor, that he took this position on this, and he was a much loved general by his troops.
Highland, California, good morning.
Good morning. I have several questions, but I'm going to limit it to two. But I wondered if C-SPAN had an email address where I could ask some of the less significant questions, not to take up time on the air.
There is an American President site. If you go to the C-SPAN homepage, cspan.org, it's hyperlinked to the American President site, and you can get more information and perhaps ask some more of those questions.
These questions aren't necessarily only about the American President series, however.
That'd be a good place to start.
Okay, fine. My first question is that there's been a lot of talk about the previous presidents being deists, in that they believed in God but not necessarily an organized sect of religion. And we're now coming up to the period where more evangelistic type of period came in. In fact, in the Civil War, I believe the motto, "In God We Trust," got put on coins. What was Mr. Taylor's religious aspect?
Albert Smith.
Well, he was raised an Episcopalian. They didn't always have chaplains or churches out there on the frontier where he was serving. From time to time in letters, he would refer to God. And in fact, when he was elected, when he was first elected, he said, in effect, you know, that in effect God's in his heaven, that democracy has been justified. He didn't wear his religion on his sleeve, but I think part of the self-confidence, the inner security that he always showed up probably reflects a religious faith.
Hickory, North Carolina.
Good morning. Other than the occasional tendency of some of your callers to try to drag men of the 18th and 19th century into the 20th century, I'm very much enjoying this series, and thank you for it. I wanted to ask Mr. Smith what he thought about a school of thought that would indicate that had President Taylor not died and he would have opposed the Compromise of 1850 on grounds of being a Unionist, that would have brought the Civil War on 10 or 11 years earlier, and that General Taylor would have prosecuted it much more fiercely than did Irvin McDowell or McClellan and those Union generals who started the war.
Well, I think that's entirely mistaken. To begin with, Taylor did not oppose the Compromise of 1850. As long as the compromise was in the form of separate bills dealing with each issue, Taylor was for it. But when they combined it into one bill, which could not possibly pass because there were too many people opposed one or more parts of it, that he opposed. And he opposed this. He considered, and I think quite correctly, that combining the compromise measures in one bill was a Southern ploy to get what they could get in return for a free California. See, Taylor had sent a slave-holding Georgian out to California to help the Californians form a state. He believed that the best way to avoid a conflict between North and South was to make California and New Mexico into states as soon as possible. Because once they became states, there was no argument. Because states' rights, after all, was holy writ for the South. The argument was always whether or not they could have slavery while they were still a territory, because territories belonged, in theory, to all the states. He didn't, and he instructed his envoy to California, don't take sides on the slavery issue. Now, the Southerners, by combining it, they put in another part of it that Taylor was very strong on. When Texas was annexed to the United States, well, before it was annexed, when Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836, it wrote a constitution. It defined its boundaries to include large parts of 4 Mexican states that had never at any time been part of Texas. Texans always do things in a big way. This included 2/3 of present-day New Mexico. However, when the war started and the United States invaded New Mexico, the Americans conquered New Mexico with the silver bullet. The Mexican generals put out proclamations they would fight to the death. Then they surrendered without firing a shot, and all of a sudden their economic circumstances improved considerably. But as part of the agreement by which New Mexico surrendered without anyone getting killed over it, without any fighting, New Mexico was promised by the United States that it would maintain its integrity, it would be a territory, and would eventually become a state. Now, Texas starts claiming its rights in New Mexico. Texas in 1849, I guess it was, or 48, they organized, the Texas legislature organized New Mexico into 6 Texas counties and announced they were sending officials to take it over. New Mexico sent word, if you send officials, you better send an army along with them to protect them. Now, that's a very important sectional issue because as part of Mexico, both California and New Mexico had been free. And there's no chance that New Mexico is going to go slave. But if it belongs to Texas, it is slave, because Texas is a slave state. And Taylor was absolutely determined to enforce the promise that the United States government had made. He sent extra troops to New Mexico to protect it. At one point, he said, he sent an envoy to New Mexico with instructions, said, tell the general that I will be with him myself if necessary. That if Texas fired one shot against New Mexico, he would personally lead the United States Army against Texas. And this is a very important issue, and by tying the two together, you see, the Southerners hoped to trade. They knew California would be free, there's no question about it. But by tying them together, maybe they could make a swap. In fact, I've got a quotation here that explains that very, very well from Senator Butler of South Carolina. He said, the great object to be obtained was this. There were 3 vessels at sea. One of them, California, was strong enough to carry the other and weaker vessels into port, if connected with her. California was a large and safe ship, and the other smaller boats were to be attached to her, and she would carry them all safely into port.
I'm going to take a call and ask you to hold. Milford,
I haven't finished. I haven't answered his question yet.
let me get a call. We got a call. Been waiting a long time. Okay. And we'll come back. Milford, Pennsylvania.
Hang on. I'll answer that. Continue that answer.
Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Smith. I have a 2-part question. First, I would like to know if the Marquis de Lafayette had any influence over the leadership qualities and soldiering skills of Zachary Taylor, and I'd also like to ask if perhaps you'd know of an organization that would deal with the descendants of the Marquis de Lafayette. I know he's been very influential on many of our presidents, and I was just curious to know, since many of the descendants of the presidents are showcased, if perhaps we could get some information on the Marquis de Lafayette. And I thank you very much, and I'll go off the air to listen to your...
I'm sorry, you're talking about...
She was asking what impact the Lafayette had on Zachary Taylor, and also if there was information about descendants of Lafayette.
I really can't answer that question. I don't know that Lafayette had whether he had any influence on Taylor or not.
Earlier you talked about the secessionist feelings of those times. How did Zachary Taylor approach and deal with those who were advocating secession?
Well, I would like to finish I'm sorry that I can't answer that last question because it's beyond me, but I would like to get back to the question before that I was giving a long answer to. The fact that Taylor did not oppose compromise, he opposed that compromise bill which put all these things together. He knew it couldn't pass to begin with, and he knew the only way it could pass, if it ever passed, it would pass only with Southern support after they had amended it to give New Mexico to California, and that he would not stand for. Ultimately, Taylor had his own way. After he died, they defeated the omnibus bill. And the compromise that passed was almost exactly what Taylor wanted. California came in as a free state. New Mexico kept its original boundaries, got a territorial constitution with no mention of slavery. And I've argued this with Ms. Rising, who will be on later, that I don't think he would have vetoed any part of this bill at all. The question that the other part of that question would, if war had come, would Taylor have persecuted it more vigorously than Abraham Lincoln did? I think the answer is no. I do not believe that Taylor would have ever drawn his sword, would have ever fought a war against the South. He owned 140 slaves. His son was later a Confederate general, and this is what he kept saying over and over, that he would defend the rights of the South. He would also defend the rights of the North. His objective was to prevent a civil war in 1850. And you can say, well, and I think his approach to the South, you can't get New Mexico, you can't get California, so why stir up the North about it? Why incur all of this enmity against yourself? Settle for what we've got. And no one is threatening slavery at all in 1850. In fact, no one was threatening slavery where it existed in 1860. So I don't think that the war would have been prosecuted. I don't think Taylor would have gone to war against the South. He did threaten to hang. 3 Southerners came to him and said, well, they wanted him to promise that he would not sign the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso was a provision that there should never be any slavery in the territories taken from New Mexico. And Taylor had said over and over in both letters and in speeches and privately that he believed, and this was very much a Whig doctrine, and he was a member of the Whig Party, he believed that a president should veto bills only if they were unconstitutional. And the Wilmot Proviso was constitutional. It never passed. He never had to make a choice between vetoing it or not. But he told his Southerners, I will not promise to veto it. If they pass it, it's constitutional, And they threatened, well, maybe we'll secede. And he said, you try that and I'll hang you as high as I hang traitors in Mexico. So he...
Going to get a call from New Philadelphia, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. It's been a long wait, and it's costing me 10 cents a minute. My question is frivolous, I think, in relation to the rest of the things we've been talking about, but there's a statue of the general and the president. It shows that his lapels are draped right over left. And I'm 80 years old. I'll be 80 years old on the 17th of June. And I wore double-breasted suits sometimes, but it was always the other way around. And I wondered when it changed, or if it changed, or if this is a mistake, or what's going on here.
I have no idea. I'm sorry I can't help you with that. Taylor didn't pay that much attention to his uniform. I mean, they could have given him one that with the buttons on either side. I don't think it would have made the slightest difference to him.
We are today at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. The director of the cemetery here is Gary Peak, and from where we are, we're about centrally located in this cemetery, and about 200 yards just north of where we are is a statue commemorating the 12th president, and Director Gary Peak is with us. Mr. Peak, thank you very much for letting us come this morning. Tell us a little bit about where you are in the cemetery.
Okay, we're in the Zachary Taylor family burial plot, which consists of approximately 1/2 acre. Zachary Taylor's boyhood home was about a quarter of a mile away, and this was part of his family's farm and, of course, his family burial plot.
What is directly behind you?
This is the burial site for Zachary Taylor after he was brought from Washington, D.C. Initially, he was buried in the receiving vault in the Congressional Cemetery. 3 months later, he was brought to Jefferson County and placed in this tomb. 2 years later, his wife, Margaret, in 1852, was buried here as well. Inside the tomb are old gravesite markers that have been replaced by newer markers. There are also pieces of marble that were used to construct the stand that held the caskets.
Now, not too far from that original location is where President Taylor and his wife are now interred. How far away is their burial spot now from that position?
Approximately 30 feet.
And why is it that they were moved to the second location?
Well, the federal government felt that this location, this limestone mausoleum, would be a more appropriate setting for the burial of the president and his wife. So this was constructed in 1926 with federal funds. Inside the mausoleum are 2 marble crypts that contain the remains of President Taylor and his wife.
And are the doors normally open?
No. These glass-lined bronze doors are normally kept closed.
Tell us a little bit about, you mentioned being in the Taylor portion of the cemetery. What's the relationship between the federal government and the Taylor family regarding this cemetery?
Well, the 1/2 acre that we were just standing on is actually owned by the descendants of Zachary Taylor. But as a courtesy to the family, the National Cemetery Administration maintains the cemetery grounds and the markers for the family. It is within the confines of the National Cemetery, but it is owned by the heirs of Zachary Taylor.
And then not too far from where you are is the statue commemorating the 12th president. What do we see in this statue and what's written on it?
Well, this is a granite monument surmounted by the marble statue of President Taylor. This was erected by the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 1883. At the base of the monument are inscribed the military campaigns of General Taylor. The War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole Conflict, and the War with Mexico.
You mentioned that this was put up by the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Expand a little bit on the relationship again between the Commonwealth and the federal government regarding this monument.
Well, the cemetery at the time in 1925, this was state-owned property. So the state donated 5 acres to the federal government for the establishment of a national cemetery. And then at a later date, in 1928, they donated an additional 16 acres for the National Cemetery, which gives us our present-day size of the National Cemetery.
Also, behind where you are is the Taylor family plot. As you walk back there to show us what's back there from the Taylor family, tell us a little bit more about this cemetery. How many people are buried here and the size of your staff?
Well, we have 13,000 individuals buried at the National Cemetery. We have a staff of 5 caretakers who maintain the grounds, and we have an administrative employee who manages the office. The cemetery has been here since 1928, and our responsibility is to bury veterans and their family members with dignity and to maintain these grounds as national shrines.
Are there any new spaces available here?
Pardon?
Are there any new spaces available?
No, sir. We just have spaces available for eligible family members who already have a loved one interred in the cemetery.
You are now back in the Taylor area, and when I walked through there yesterday, I noticed a number of people whose first name, middle name, or last name is Taylor.
That's correct. President Taylor's father, Colonel Richard Taylor, is buried here, and President Taylor's mother, Sarah, she was buried here in 1822, and Colonel Richard Taylor was buried here in 1829. Zachary Taylor also has two of his brothers buried here, George Taylor and Hancock Taylor, and two of his sisters, Elizabeth Lee and Sarah Gray, are also interred in this cemetery.
How many Taylor descendants are there?
Well, we have 69 that are buried here.
And how long have you been director of the cemetery?
I've been the director since 1985.
And what's
I've been with the Department of Veterans Affairs since 1973.
From being here for that time, what's your sense of what people in this area know about Zachary Taylor?
I'm sorry?
What's your sense of what people in this area of the country know about Zachary Taylor?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Asking about if people in this area know about President Taylor being buried here and what your sense is of what they know about him.
Okay, yes they do. I mean, when Zachary Taylor was exhumed in 1991, that generated a lot of media attention, and a lot of people in this area who were not aware that the 12th president was buried here were made known of that fact, and that actually brought more visitors to the cemetery.
Gary Peak is director of the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery. Thanks very much for that look around this portion regarding Zachary Taylor.
You're quite welcome, and thanks for joining us here on Memorial Day.
Appreciate it. And Dr. Smith, we've talked a lot about early on about his personality. Who were his close friends over the years?
Perhaps one of the closest was Jefferson Davis, and that's an interesting story. Taylor was serving out on the frontier, and Davis was a lieutenant under his command, and Taylor's daughter fell in love with Jefferson Davis. And Taylor did not like this. He tried to tell her, look, what a harsh, tough life your poor mothers had to lead following me around out here on the frontier. You don't really want to marry an Army officer. This made Davis so angry that at one point he threatened to challenge his commanding officer to a duel, but fortunately Davis's friends talked him out of this. You know, you don't want to shoot if he shoots you, that won't help, and if you shoot him, how can you expect the girl to marry you? Well, Davis finally gave in, and Taylor gave in. Davis ultimately left the Army, and Taylor's daughter married Davis, but then died shortly thereafter. They got seriously ill in Mississippi, and she died. Taylor and Davis were finally reconciled. Davis fought with great bravery at Buena Vista under Taylor in the Mexican War, and they carried on a long a lot of letters back and forth till he died. Ultimately, they disagreed harshly, and I have a letter here that Taylor wrote to Davis. I think is highly complimentary.
I'll tell you what,
well, what he said in effect was, we're different, we disagree, and but I expect you to follow your own mind, to follow what you believe in, and I want you to know that this will not make the slightest difference in our personal relationships. And Davis's second wife wrote in her own memoirs that she would never forget the loving kindness she got from the Taylor family, that they adopted her just like the long-lost daughter that they had lost. And so some of the most revealing things that Taylor said about himself that gives you an idea of what he believed in, he wrote to Davis.
We have two calls from California. Sacramento's first. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to ask Dr. Smith, what's his personal view of the theory that history is a series of great men biographies? And secondly, what part does the Irish immigration and European immigration, which I believe the famines were started under Taylor, and that Irish started to come over to the U.S. in substantial numbers, and what part did that play as to the onset of the Civil War, both as a political force and as a force to man an army to fight?
That's hard to define. The first question, certainly you can't study history without studying the men who were the movers and shakers. On the other hand, as Lincoln said, I claim not to have shaped events, but events have shaped me, so that you can't really define history as exclusively a study of great men or exclusively a study of great social movements, economic movements. You just have to look at the whole great big picture. Men respond to the circumstances in which they're born, where they're placed. Some respond differently from others. You can cite instances where having one person president might have made a difference. The policy would have been different from someone else. On the Irish question, the Irish tended to not necessarily defend slavery, but in large numbers they were seriously worried about the possibility that if the slaves were freed, they would come north and take the jobs. And so you did have, I'm sorry to say, a strong strain of racial prejudice there, partly because the Irish themselves were victims of ethnic prejudice. And in fact, that's one of the themes in our history, that each ethnic group that came and got assimilated tended to be against the next ethnic group to come. So that the Irish, there were a lot of Irish in the army. As soldiers, they fought very well. On the other hand, the Irish in New York City were primarily responsible for the great riot 2 weeks after Gettysburg, in which several hundred blacks were killed. Just people went up down the street. Lincoln had to send an army to New York to put down these riots. And I'm not an expert on the ethnic Irish at all, but it's not consistent, and that's another thing about history. You know, you try to make generalizations. You can say, well, they were racist, they didn't want the slaves freed, and yet you can find heroes, regiments and so on, where they fought and fought extremely well. And I guess they contributed and acted much like the other ethnic groups. Now the Germans who came after the revolutions of 31 and 48 in Germany, in which they had tried to create a democratic Germany and were crushed. And then they came thoroughly imbued with all the principles of democracy and so on. And when Lincoln talked about government of, by, and for the people, they were ready to fight in large numbers. And they were strongly against slavery.
San Francisco, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for this great series about the American presidents. My question is about Zachary Taylor's appointment as a lieutenant in the Army. Did he have any military training before his appointment, or did he receive on-the-job training after his appointment? He must have, done well to have made general. And when they were showing the monument in the cemetery, I noticed the word Okeechobee on the side of it, which of course is a lake in Florida, so I was wondering if that referred to the Seminole War, and I'll get off the phone and listen to the response. And thank you again for the series.
You're welcome.
Well, he had very little military training. What happened in the wars in those days, the lieutenants were usually selected from the educated, better-off families. And so he simply went into the Army as a lieutenant and by and large did get on the job training. But from the beginning, he showed a tremendous ability to command. He went up the ladder, lieutenant, each office he held, he was almost always in command of something. He was first in command of a smaller group and so on. His ability to command was always recognized. And he, in the War of 1812 and in the Indian Wars, he performed very bravely and very skillfully, and went up the line. As I said earlier, he was not popular on the frontier. He believed in, he always spoke his mind. He thought the Black Hawk War, for example, was caused by the American government violating its pledges. And, but having spoken his mind, he obeyed his orders and fought and won the battles. He was against the Mexican War. He opposed the annexation of Texas. He didn't want to be the didn't want to start this war, but once it started, he fought it, and fought it extremely well. The last part of that question
was about the note on the monument down there, perhaps referring to the Seminole War?
Oh, yeah. Well, several generals tried to catch the Seminoles. We spent 10 years trying to round up 1,500 Seminoles and never could catch them. Taylor did about as good a job as anyone. He won a couple of battles. And again, his individualistic independence of character showed itself there. He promised the Seminoles, certain ones, if they would surrender, they could keep the blacks, slaves who had escaped from the South and had joined the Indians. And when they surrendered and he was going to send them west, numerous Southerners put in claims to get their slaves back. And he said, no. You know, I made this promise and they're going. And so something like 400 blacks who had escaped from their Southern masters went west with the Indians. Taylor would never violate a pledge made. He didn't win in Florida. In fact, neither did anyone else. There's another rather amusing story came out of that. Taylor imported a bunch of bloodhounds. The problem was you couldn't find the Indians. You know, you were roaming through the Everglades and you were dodging snakes and alligators, and you were trying to find the Indians to catch them, to move them to the west. And he imported these bloodhounds. This caused a tremendous hue and cry in the North especially. Taylor assured them that he was not going to let the dogs bite anybody, that they all had muzzles, that their job was to find them, not to attack them. They had muzzles. John Quincy Adams made a speech in which he inquired as to whether or not the bloodhounds would be eligible for pensions as war veterans later. And of course, nothing came of it. The bloodhounds led the American Army back and forth for about 3 months, and they never did find any Indians either. And finally, we gave up, and Taylor was part of the sensible final solution. Taylor simply said, look, those Indians aren't bothering the settlers, and the settlers can take care of themselves, you know. Let them stay.
His Army life paralleled his family life. He was married at a relatively young age. Tell us about his wife and what his family life was like that paralleled his Army career.
His wife went with him almost everywhere except when he was actually fighting battles. When he was commander of these different forts and bases out in the West, she was right there with him as well as children. Margaret, yeah. But he had a very, if you can measure a man's, partly measure his enlightenment by his ambitions for his children. His daughters got the best education available. He sent them back east for a good education. And his son, he sent his son to Paris. His son spent a year in Paris in school and then spent a year in Edinburgh, and then came back and graduated from Yale. And he didn't want his son to be a military man. He urged him, said, get a literary education. And he saw to it that the kid got the best possible kind of literary education. His children adored him.
Do you think that advice came from his education?
Well, he recognized the value of education. And between wars, between commands, at one point where he had about 6 months off, he toured the North. He took his family. They went to New York, they went to Buffalo, they went to Boston. He traveled all over the North, and he didn't have any false illusions about Northern power, and he didn't believe in any of the Southern stereotypes about the North. He looked at the North for himself. And this is why he was ready to defend the North's right to oppose slavery. Someone asked about his close friends. One of his very closest friends was William Henry Seward, whose most noteworthy comment in the Senate was that well, the Constitution recognizes slavery, but there's a higher law than the Constitution, God's law, which does not recognize slavery. Well, Taylor loved to have Seward over for dinner and argue with him. They got most of the patronage in New York State, which undercut his own vice president, Fillmore, but that's another story. Southerners were furious over this. You know, they believed that Seward was influencing him. Seward didn't influence him. But Taylor, remember, was a minority president. The other two candidates got 160,000 more votes than he did. He didn't have a majority in either house of Congress. he needed to unite North and South. And some have said that Seward used Taylor. I'm not sure, but Taylor didn't use Seward because he was trying to bring the two sections together behind some of the other policies that had nothing to do with slavery. But his sons-in-law were his dear friends, too. His daughters married good men. One married a doctor who became Taylor's personal physician for a long time. He wrote long letters to his two sons-in-laws. They were close friends of his, and Seward and others. His cabinet, particularly Secretary of the Treasury Meredith, he got very close with them. In fact, if you read the letters that his cabinet wrote to their families, or wrote back and forth, or wrote to other people, or to each other, they had tremendous respect for him and affection for him. And while Taylor's enemies were saying that, well, he's just the tool of this cabinet, they made it quite plain in their own writings that he was the boss. He was always the boss. He made the decisions.
Havre de Grace, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. It's a great series as always, and I'm interested in the sort of political campaign that Zachary Taylor ran for president. A little flavor about that, and also this is sort of like the demise of the Whig Party, and if Dr. Smith could talk to both of those issues, I'd be interested.
Okay. Well, he didn't run, really. I mean, he accepted the nomination. He didn't find out he had been nominated for a month because he got what we would today call fan letters, and they often came postage due. So he simply sent a notice that he would no longer accept any things that were postage due, and the official letter informing him that he had been nominated to run for president came postage due. It got sent back to the dead letter office. It was a month after he got nominated before he even found out about it. Now, he didn't make any speeches. He wrote a few public letters in which he expressed his principles, and one of those was that he would only veto bills that were unconstitutional. So that he campaigned practically not at all. As for the demise of the Whig Party, there we get to the election of 1852, and Fillmore. If Fillmore had wanted to run in the beginning, he would have been nominated and might have very well have won. Unfortunately, perhaps, Fillmore did not want a second term as president, and didn't get into the race till the last minute when it looked like General Scott was going to be the nominee. And at the last minute, Fillmore tried to get renominated and led for a long time on the various ballots, but the Southerners had their way and General Scott was nominated. General Scott was very much the protege of William Henry Seward, who again had the most remarkable talent for ingratiating himself with all kinds of people. The South would not take Scott, and so Scott's nomination broke the Whig Party into Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, and they never got back together. The nomination of Scott, instead of Fillmore, really brought about the demise of the Whig Party. There's another interesting parallel there. You compare Scott with Taylor. Scott was known as Old Fuss and Feathers. He was about 6'6". He made these very dramatic pronouncements. Incidentally, if you drive through Washington, you always know when you're in Scott Square because it's the only statue where the general's bigger than his horse. But Scott reminds one very much of General Douglas MacArthur, really. He was an able general. He desperately wanted to be president. Never made it. Finally got nominated and lost by a huge margin. He was a terrible presidential candidate. Taylor, on the other hand, is very much like Eisenhower, very much a man of the people. There were no fuss and feathers about General Eisenhower, and he wasn't exactly rough and ready like Taylor was, but it was the same kind of comparison. The American people were ready to vote for Taylor, but not for Scott. And that brought about the demise of the Whig Party.
We are at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, and our guest for most of this program, Elbert Smith. He is the author of the book, The Presidencies of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. He has a B.A. from Maryville College in Tennessee, an M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. He taught at Iowa State, the University of Wisconsin, also the University of Maryland, where he is Professor Emeritus. He's the author of 5 books, and one including a book on the presidency of James Buchanan. And he was born in Kentucky, in Benham. He's been married since 1944 with 5 children, 10 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. With us for the rest of our time. Birmingham, Alabama, good morning.
Yes, I've got an interesting thing about the ancestry of President Taylor and President Madison. There's a book I'm sure Professor Smith knows about from log cabins to the White House, which traces the Taylor family back to England, of which there's an interesting ancestor. It talks about Reverend Dr. Roland Taylor, who was burned at the stake in 1554 when he got into a squabble with the Catholics who took over after Henry VIII died. Just wonder if you might pass the word on from log cabins to the White House. There's another interesting member of the Taylor family tree, and that's the General George Patton, I'm sure you know of. And I was just looking on the tree. It has a bunch of Smiths. Are you in the tree, Professor Smith?
I'm not sure I am. I have to make a confession. My great-grandfather came to Tennessee after the Civil War and married my great-grandmother and produced 2 children, and then suddenly disappeared. He said his name was Smith, so my name is Smith, but I'm not part of that particular family tree, although I can trace my ancestry back to England on one side and to Germany in 1700 on another side.
In a number of these programs we've done of presidents of this era, the question of slavery comes up not only as a national issue, but in their personal lives. Zachary Taylor was a slaveholder. Tell us a little bit about his position on slavery.
Well, I think one of the reasons why he didn't resent anti-slavery people, he had no guilt feelings. Now, there's a tendency to condemn people just because they own slavery. People are saying, why should George Washington be father of his country? He owned slavery. Jefferson owned slavery. Actually, 8 of our first 12 presidents owned slaves. You're going to just throw out the 8 presidents who made this country what it became. And of the 4 who did not own slaves, Harrison only lived a month after he became president. Van Buren was very pro-Southern. The only 2 presidents out of the first 12 who ever criticized slavery at all were John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Taylor treated his slaves as human beings, as people. He was kind with them. He insisted they not be overworked. He selected his overseers very carefully. Being an overseer was not a long-term job for most people because the slaves could make it unpleasant. And he had good overseers. On one occasion, and he may have done this more than once, unfortunately, most of Taylor's letters were burned in his house when the Union Army burned Taylor's home in Louisiana during the Civil War. But there is a letter extant in Taylor's own handwriting to an overseer. He said, in effect, we've had a good crop this year. Distribute $500 among the slaves. Only he didn't call them slaves. He never used the word. He always referred to his slaves as servants. Distribute $500 among the servants according to merit. And I have to believe he probably did this more than once. But the letters ordering it just got burned. And unlike Jackson, who died broke, and Washington, who died money broke, Jefferson, who died money broke, all of these people who owned slaves and died broke, Taylor died a very rich man. He started with practically nothing. He inherited a very small plantation. He sold it, bought more. And even though he spent all of his time in the Army and got a very low salary, he kept accumulating plantations and slaves, and they kept making him money. And I think the reason is that his slaves worked because they were treated well. And they liked being a member of his family, which he treated them like members of the family. You know, if you've ever lived on a farm, you know there's no place on earth where you can look busy doing less. And I know that from experience. I know a lot of slaves learned that early. After the Civil War ended, within 20 years, the southern cotton crop almost doubled. The former slave, who's now a sharecropper, living in his own little place with his wife and family, produced twice as much as he did before. So that Taylor never felt any guilt about slavery. He lived, and it's a mistake to criticize people and judge people by the standards of our day rather than the standards of their day. Taylor and Washington and Jefferson, these people, Madison, Monroe, Madison, the father of the Constitution, they were born into slaveholding families. And you're born in a situation at a particular time. You grow up being taught what's right, being taught what's wrong. I think the key thing is, does the person live up to the best standards of his day rather than ours? And Taylor certainly did that. And when he died, he left word he wanted the slaves to be taken care of and not to be overworked. Let me add this very quickly. He didn't free them. A lot of people didn't, because there was a bad habit Southerners had. Some Southerners had. A slave would get to be 65 years old and couldn't work anymore, and you set him free. Now, what's he going to do? You see. And in fact, several Southern states passed laws against manumission to protect the slave. And so that's Taylor as a slaveholder, and he was perfectly willing to be friends with people who disagreed with him on it.
We've got a break coming up, but try to get a couple of calls in first. Richmond, Virginia, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Your previous guest had mentioned that several years ago President Taylor's body was exhumed, and I do recall that, and I was wondering what, I don't know who to exactly direct the question to, but if we could answer, what historically was accomplished by that? How was history added to? I know it had related to suspicions about the circumstances of his death, but I want to comment on that.
We are going to talk about that in a segment coming up after the break, so let me ask you to hold that question, and we'll get another call from Pacifica, California. Good morning.
Good morning.
Pacifica?
Good morning.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, I want to thank you very much for your series, and I think it's great, and I very much appreciate it. I just have a couple quick questions for Dr. Smith. One is, what was the relationship between President Taylor and Vice President Fillmore? Did they know each other before they were put on the same ticket? And where did President Taylor get his nickname, Old Rough and Ready? Did he get that from his people who served under him, or how did he acquire that? And I'll take my answers off the air, and I thank you very much.
I'll answer the second one first, because it's very short. The troops gave it to him. The troops gave it to him. He just, I don't know which one first suggested it, but they referred to him as Old Rough and Ready, and the press picked it up, and so he's always been Old Rough and Ready. He and Fillmore did not know each other before they were put on the same ticket. They were highly compatible up to a point, but unfortunately, well, the Whig Party had only had elected one president before Taylor, and he only lived 30 days, and the vice president had been a Democrat, so that the Whig Party had been waiting 30 years to get some of the federal jobs, or 20 years to get the federal jobs, the patronage. And so the Taylor administration had a terrible time passing out the jobs. The cabinet was kept up night after night after night on this. It was a difficult situation. Now, the patronage in New York was extremely important. New York was a very important big state. Fillmore was the leading Whig in western New York. He was from Buffalo. Senator Seward, whom we've talked about before, was the leading Whig in eastern New York from Albany. And the most powerful newspaper in New York was run by Thurlow Weed, who dreamed of making his dear buddy Seward president. So there was a fierce rivalry between Fillmore and Seward. Seward ingratiated himself into Taylor's friendship and ended up getting the patronage and cut Fillmore loose. So Fillmore's friends were very unhappy about this, and Fillmore was not happy about it either. But he was still very, very loyal. But their relationship was not close. It would have been difficult to be close to both Seward and Fillmore, and Seward got there first, so that their relationship was cool. But Fillmore always, in the things he wrote and said, was always very respectful. He admired Taylor. And Fillmore was a good man in this respect, too. He did not build up deep resentments.
All right, we're going to take a call before the break, and we'll come back. Taylor, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good.
Good. My community, which is located in an area south of Detroit, is named for General Zachary Taylor, when Mr. Taylor was a Mexican war hero who would go on to become President of the United States. And I know you sometimes talk to people from certain communities. I'm the public information coordinator from our city, and we're proud to be named for Zachary Taylor.
Is there a monument to him in town?
There is not a monument, but there is a plaque in our Heritage Park, which is a small historical park, a lovely historical park, actually, in the center of our community.
And do you know if the schools make a special emphasis on teaching about him?
They do come up. He does come up at some, at many schools, actually, but not as a, we don't probably honor him enough as we should. Our community is formerly an agricultural community that grew steadily over the years, and now we are a wonderful bedroom community. We have comfortable neighborhoods, a variety of shopping opportunities, and everybody's allowed to live, work, and shop all in a convenient 24 square miles. And
what's the population?
70,000 people.
And how far are you? Say you're near Detroit?
Yes, we're south of Detroit.
About how far?
Near Metropolitan Airport. We're about a half-mile south of Detroit.
Okay, thanks for that call from Taylor, Michigan, a number of towns around the country named for our presidents. Albert Smith with us, the author of a book about Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore, back after we take a short break. But coming up after this break, William Gist will tell us about Springfield. It was Zachary Taylor's boyhood home, and it's just on the other side of the backside of this cemetery where we are. And also Clara Rising, who's a historian and former professor at the University of Florida. We'll talk to her about her theories of the death of Zachary Taylor. We'll have all that, and we'll be right back. American President's Life Stories is continuing on this Memorial Day. The 131st Memorial Day started in 1868. And we are at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, talking about our 12th president, Zachary Taylor, the second president to die in office just 9 years after the death of William Henry Harrison. And joining us for a few minutes is William Gist. He's the owner of Springfield, which is Zachary Taylor's boyhood home. Mr. Gist, thank you very much for being with us.
Good morning.
Tell us a little bit about what you knew about Zachary Taylor before you bought Springfield and what you've learned since.
Oh, before I bought Springfield, I didn't know very much. But when I was able to get the house, ever since then, my wife and I were real students of Taylor and became to appreciate him very much.
Your wife has since passed away.
Yes, she has.
You are near her burial plot there. Tell us about her connection to Zachary Taylor.
Well, we were told by the Taylors, she was told by the Taylors that she was the Taylor's favorite non-Taylor Taylor. And so tragically, in 1996, she died. But 3 years before that, she found out in looking at her genealogy that she was a Pendleton, and her Pendleton line ran back to Orange County. And I said, well, the Taylors were from Orange County. And so she started checking, and she found out that she was distantly related to the Taylors. But when she was in hospice in '96, the head of the Taylor family came down from Orange County and looked at the genealogy, and they said, yes, it would be very appropriate for her to be in the Taylor family cemetery. And she would be very pleased to be here.
Because of the trees, from where we are in our cameras, we can't see the house. But if you would, by pointing and giving directions to our camera people, tell us where the house is from here and what you see when you walk up to it?
Okay, we're on a hill here, and between where we are here, it's directly over my shoulder, and it's on a hill over here, just about 300 yards.
And when people walk up to the house, what does it look like?
The house is a Georgian colonial house. It was the Taylors arrived on the property in 1785, and they built a cabin, and then it took about 5 years. The house was completed by 1790, and at that point, it was a side hall colonial. And then in 1820, an addition was put on to make the house larger. So that's the size of the house at this point. And Taylor got his name Old Rough and Ready because of his actions in the wars, but the house has already been through its own wars. In the early part of the 1800s, the house was hit by an earthquake, and then in the late part of the 1800s, it had a major fire in the dining room, which caused it to have to be painted just like our White House. And then in April the 3rd of 1974, it was hit by a tornado. It's a direct hit, which precipitated the restoration, and the restoration went on for 4.5 years.
I know you don't have a monitor out there, so you won't be able to see this, but we have some footage that was taken earlier inside the house. Just in a general sense, describe for us what people see inside.
Well, it's pretty obvious when you get in the house of which is the old side and which is the new side. On the 1790 side, all the woodwork is walnut, and it's in a finished form. On the so-called new side, or 1820 side, the woodwork is all painted. So it's pretty obvious which side of the house you're on when you're inside.
What is there in the house that is from Zachary Taylor's time or from him directly?
Unfortunately, the only artifact that we have that was there when the Taylors were there is a small rocker, which is in the kitchen, and that was given to our friend, to us by a local friend, historian Lynn Renault, and she wanted us to have that. Other than that, we have nothing that belonged to the Taylors.
We've talked about the house. Describe for us what that homestead looked like then, and what the area around your house looks like now.
Well, at that point there was 450 acres here, and as late as 1950 there were still 40 acres, and the land was sold off, and so now the property is on just a little bit less than an acre. If it had more acreage, then it would be a museum, but without the parking, it cannot be. So that makes it rather unique.
And there was storm damage in the early 70s. How did that affect the restoration?
Well, the April 3rd of '74, it was in a direct hit of the tornado that ripped across Jefferson County, and that precipitated the restoration, and the restoration lasted for 4.5 years. And so afterwards, we bought the house after it was restored, and we did some finishing things to it, but basically the house was in wonderful restored condition when we bought it.
For people who study about Zachary Taylor or visit this site, what do you hope they take away from the experience or know about him?
Well, I would like for Zachary to become better known. I think even in Jefferson County, sometimes I think that people are not aware that an American president was from this area and is in fact buried here. And I think that he deserves more attention than he's got it.
William Gist is the owner of Springfield. It's the boyhood home of Zachary Taylor, just beyond the boundaries of the cemetery here. Thanks very much for spending a few minutes with us.
Thank you.
Joining us on our set now, along with Dr. Smith, is Dr. Clara Rising. She's a former professor at the University of Florida. Thanks very much for being with us. Tell us about when you first became interested in Zachary Taylor and what your research led you to conclude about his death.
I want to say a word before I start that. This is Memorial Day, and 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Among them, 4 of my great-uncles with the Confederacy. 2 rode with Nathan Bedford Forrest, 2 died at Shiloh. But one who rode with Nathan Bedford Forrest fought in a little skirmish at Denmark, Tennessee. And just by luck, I found a book with a chapter about that skirmish. The last sentence of that chapter said, "Our casualties were light. We lost only one man." And I thought, then there are no light casualties. I wrote a book on General John Hunt Morgan, the cavalry commander, Confederate cavalry commander. And it received the Jefferson Davis Award from the Round Table of Louisville. And I was invited to give a speech at Robert E. Lee's birthday, January 19th. And Dr. Gist was president of the Round Table at that time and invited me to stay at Springfield. And it was Bill's wife, Betty, who first told me that the family had some severe doubts about the diagnosis of gastroenteritis at Taylor's death. So I went back to Florida and started research with that, and that's how I got interested in it.
And your conclusion about his death was what?
That it's inconclusive.
But you had suspicions.
Oh, yes.
And those are?
And those are. Actually, if I had to boil it down to suspects, there are three, I think, that I would think about. We have to remember that the White House in those days had no FBI, no Secret Service. Mrs. Taylor often complained that people were wandering around upstairs in the bedrooms. Taylor himself, as was mentioned, took a stroll, you know, after being at the Washington Monument before he came back. However, there was one person at the White House, Dr. Thomas Miller, who was known as the physician for the presidents. We must remember, as you mentioned, that President Harrison died 9 years before, and there was some suspicion that Harrison had been poisoned. Dr. Miller was his doctor, and I found a long article in the Boston Journal of Surgery and Medicine, which was the forerunner of the New England Journal of Medicine, accusing him of malpractice with suggestions of much worse. And then I realized this is all circumstantial, but sometimes if you're looking at the periphery of a problem, you find circumstantial items. Then there was a letter from an Oliver Parker, who was a hotel proprietor in Philadelphia, who wrote Lincoln. And Dr. Miller was still around the White House at that time. And he told Lincoln that he knew for a fact that Miller had poisoned Harrison and probably Zachary Taylor, and if Lincoln didn't change his attitudes towards slavery, he could expect the same.
We've got a good segment here to talk about this, about your theories and response from Dr. Smith also, but we're going to have to get a few calls in. Philadelphia is our first call in this segment. Good morning.
Yes, I just had a comment to make. I've been traveling around the country for the last several years viewing many of the presidential sites, and one of my most memorable was visiting Springfield, Zachary Taylor's home there. I had written a letter to Mrs. Gish, who had responded to me, a total stranger, inviting me to come and tour the home with a friend of mine. She was very gracious. She took us through the entire home. I was very sorry to hear just now that she had passed away. I always remember that trip as a most memorable one. We saw many of the things, the flag that was over the coffin when they exhumed the body, we saw that rocking chair, we saw some other period pieces they have in the home. And she was just most gracious. We had about an hour visit, and I just wanted to thank Mr. Gish again, and sorry to bear my condolences on the death of his wife. It was a most memorable time.
You talked about going to presidential sites. Is this something you do with some planning or something you do when you happen to be in those areas?
Well, it started out by mainly when I was in the area with a friend of mine. We were both interested in history. We would visit presidential sites that would be there, but it's taken on a life of its own. I've now visited all the graves of the presidents except Nixon. Most of the homes, in fact, I haven't been to the Fillmore house, which are going to be next. But that's about one of the few that I haven't been to.
Okay, thanks, Philadelphia.
Enjoyable.
Thank you very much. Let's move on. We'll take another call. This is from New York City. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling from New York City. I have a question. I'm a Cuban American, as such a member of the Hispanic community of the United States, and I would like to hear a little bit about Taylor's role with the Mexican population and the. I know he was involved in the Mexican War. I've never really been totally satisfied with the explanation about all these issues of manifest destiny and how the United States acquired the Southwest. Even the Texas issue is questionable itself. For when you look at it from the point of view of the Mexicans, and the Mexicans were there first, and basically how, if you could comment a little bit about the situation and how Mexicans were treated after the United States took over the Southwest.
Thanks, New York City. Albert Smith.
Well, Taylor said in the letter that he was personally opposed to the annexation of Texas. He was opposed to taking any extra territory from Mexico for Texas. He obeyed his orders. He fought, he won battles. He treated the Mexicans with great respect. After the Battle of Matamoros, for example, he had his own doctors take care of the Mexican wounded, and even at one point contributed several $100s of his own money to help the people he had just defeated. When he took Monterrey, he incurred the wrath of President Polk. Of course, Polk was by this time jealous of the possible presidential aspirations of Taylor. When he took Monterrey, after several days of really fierce fighting and a lot of bloodshed, the Mexicans offered to surrender if he would promise not to advance for a couple of months. And he wasn't going anywhere for a couple of months anyhow, because his army was, he just fought a terrible battle. He accepted this. And he always argued that he saved several hundred lives by so doing, and probably did. And he made this truce with them. He sat there for another 60 days. And then again, when the Congress voted to honor him, some of President Polk's people put in there, but that doesn't include Monterrey, even though it was a great victory. He also put out proclamations and did his best to enforce it that there should never be any warfare against civilians, and that as much as possible the daily life of people should go on just like it was. And this was the way he handled himself with the Mexicans. On the other hand, when he was approached by Santa Anna with overwhelming odds, demanded his surrender, he told a reporter, said, let them come. Said, damn if they don't go back a lot quicker than they came, see. But he was very honorable in this respect. He honored his opponents. He would win a battle, and he would make agreements, and he would keep the agreements. And he respected his opponents. He respected the Mexicans. And he respected Indians, and so on. Incidentally, he used his own money to create a school for Winnebago Indians. At one point, I'm getting away from Mexico, but that's the way he operated in Mexico.
We started our segment, Dr. Rising, talking about her research into this. We have some footage of the 1991 exhumation from one of the local stations. Tell us a little bit about logistically what had to happen for there to be an exhumation of the former president.
I would love to finish what I was talking about before, if I could.
Okay.
Just a split second. Talking about Dr. Miller, the one who they suspected manhandled President Harrison. Dr. Miller's daughter, Virginia, wrote she gave a speech in 1899 to an historical society talking about her father, Dr. Miller, and his times. And it was interesting that Dr. Miller bought the lot next door and built a house next door. They lived at 1331 F Street, and the house next door was 1329 F. And he rented it to Robert Toombs, a representative from Georgia. Robert Toombs and his buddy Alexander Stevens, I always thought of them as the Laurel and Hardy of the story, were violently anti-Taylor. In fact, when Dr. Miller built that house, he made connections. Now, whether these were underground connections between the two houses or not, I don't know. But after the Civil War, Virginia Miller talks about how they were visited by all of the Beauregard and Lee and all of the generals. And during the war, Lincoln surrounded their house with guards, because after Oliver Parker warned Lincoln about this doctor, he fired him immediately. He was still there, you know, when Lincoln was there. But back to your other question, because Toombs and Stevens are two people who I think would have done it. Exhumation. Bad term, because Latin word humus means soil or ground, and he was never in the ground. It probably disentombment might be a more accurate term. The symptoms. I brought the symptoms to Dr. Maples, the forensic pathologist at the University of Florida, and he said the symptoms are classic arsenic. So then I started research with Napoleon. The Murder of Napoleon is a title of a book. And in 1965, they started NAA, which is the neutron activation analysis method, where they bombard the hair and nails are the depositories of arsenic, the only two places. And arsenic is the only thing that would have lasted 140 years anyway. Napoleon, of course, left locks of hair taken at the time of his death. So all I was ever interested in was finding a lock of hair. Found one at the Smithsonian, but they said no, it had been compromised by pesticides in the 1930s, which had arsenic in it. And then the Cabildo in New Orleans said, oh, we have one, but then the night before I flew to New Orleans to interview the nearest living relative, they said, no, it's Andrew Jackson's. Now, the nearest living relative, I had to get permission from the nearest living relative to proceed with the exhumation, was Mr. John McElhenney, who was 84 years old at the time. I spent 4 days interviewing Mr. McElhenney. He was a delight. He was full of American history. He pulled out all the dirty linen of the family. He was a delight. So he approved of that. He was. I want to tell a little story about Mr. McElhenney.
Quick story, then we'll take a call.
Well, he owned Tabasco for one thing, and after the Civil War in the South, nobody had any money anyway. Everybody was poor, and this old friend of the families who had been in the Mexican War came by one day and said, you folks need to make a sauce. He says, I've got a recipe for a sauce. He says, you grow these peppers and you put this sauce in white oak barrels. They have to come from the Vosges Mountains of France, and you leave them in these barrels for 3 years. And this is how Tabasco started. And they were so poor, when they had their first crop, as it were, they didn't have any containers to put them in, so they went to the New Orleans dump. And they found little perfume bottles in the New Orleans dump, and that's why the Tabasco sauce is in the bottle that's shaped the way it is.
And one of the Taylor descendants. We're going to get a call from Hopedale, Massachusetts. Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for C-SPAN. It's a wonderful series. I enjoy it very much.
You're welcome.
I'd like to ask Dr. Smith if he could comment a little on the professional relationship between General Winfield Scott and President Taylor, because Scott was General-in-Chief of the United States Army, but Taylor had been his rival for all the years in the antebellum Army. And also, secondly, did President Taylor have a younger brother who, as an old man, served in the Union Army in the Civil War? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't think, I know, to the best of my knowledge, none of his brothers served the Union Army. His son was a Confederate general. As for his relations with Scott, they didn't like each other. Again, they remind one of MacArthur and Eisenhower. Taylor felt that he performed more heroically during the War of 1812 than Scott did, but Scott got all the way to brigadier general, and Taylor just made it to major, and there was always a feeling of rivalry there that Taylor performed and did a lot more things in his life of a military nature. It took a lot of hard knocks and accomplished, he thought, more than Scott did. Now, when the war started, Polk made Scott the commander-in-chief, but then Scott dilly-dallied around in Washington for 3 or 4 months getting ready, and Polk got impatient. And so he didn't exactly fire him, but he shifted the burden and he made Taylor the commander-in-chief. Then when Taylor won these spectacular battles, and people started talking about, including Abraham Lincoln, who was a member of the first committee that promoted Taylor for president, Taylor then got jealous and reversed it and made Scott the commanding general again, and he took most of Taylor's best troops, gave them to Scott for the invasion at Veracruz, left Taylor with a bunch of raw recruits to withstand a much bigger army from Santa Anna. And Santa Anna, of course, Taylor won. So Taylor got great satisfaction, I think, from the fact that he got elected president and Scott did not. In the beginning, you said that Taylor thought his supporters were sort of crazy. Taylor, after a while, looked around at the competition, and he decided his supporters weren't crazy after all. That he was quite confident that he would be a better president than these different people. Could I
Please do.
Could I answer Dr. Rising for a minute and state my position on this? First is a question of motive. As far as I'm concerned, Toombs and Stevens were men of great integrity. I can't imagine they would do this. But if you're looking at Southerners wanting to get rid of Taylor, the vice president was Millard Fillmore, who was on record as an opponent of slavery, who had in fact supported the Wilmot Proviso. Now they're going to get him instead of Taylor if Taylor dies. Taylor at no point ever supported the Wilmot Proviso. He thought it was a terrible thing, but he did say it was constitutional and he would not veto it. And of course, Fillmore owned no slaves. He had no identification with the South whatever. Taylor did. Taylor wrote to Jefferson Davis, so far as slavery is concerned, we of the South must throw ourselves on the Constitution and defend our rights to the last. And when arguments will no longer suffice, we will appeal to the sword if necessary to do so. I will be the last to yield an inch. So why would the Southerners want to get rid of a man who talks that way, who owns 140 slaves, in favor of one who has no connection and who has actually supported the Wilmot Proviso? And the second thing is they did exhume him, and they had a pretty good chance to examine him because his wife would not let them embalm him. She had trouble accepting the fact that he was dead. He had not been embalmed, and certainly the best people that I know of here in Kentucky thoroughly examined the remains and found no trace of poison whatsoever. And I would not impugn either their ability or their integrity. So I really do not think that he was assassinated or poisoned by anyone. His doctors did perform some horrendous medical steps, but they did that to everyone. They bled him, they blistered him, they dosed him up to here with calomel, which is partly mercury. But this was done, these decisions really were reached by a committee of doctors rather than just one. Taylor had several doctors fussing over it.
I'm going to get a call and then we'll get a response. But Athens, Georgia, been waiting a long time. Thanks for your patience. Good morning.
Good morning. My daughter, she's in middle school and she's doing a report on Zachary Taylor, surprisingly, and she wanted to know if she could ask you a couple of questions.
Of course.
Okay, hold on. Hello?
Hi, how are you?
Fine, and you?
I'm fine. What's your name?
Kristen.
And how old are you?
I'm 14.
And you're writing a paper for which class?
For history.
And you have some questions for us?
Mm-hmm. I had one for Mr. Smith. I was calling to find out if there is any controversy between the accomplishments of Jack Taylor and Winfield Scott.
Well, it's something you've touched on earlier about the relationship between Scott and Taylor.
Some historians have argued it, but by and large, they served in different types of capacities. Scott was very much an administrative officer. And of course, he lived longer than Taylor. Again, it's about the same argument you would have comparing MacArthur with Eisenhower. They're in different theaters. They're fighting different enemies at different times. And some of us think Taylor was a better general. Some of us think Scott was. Some people think Scott may have been a better general.
Now, this is a topic we've talked about, and for that last...
I was going to say, certainly Taylor won more battles against overwhelming odds than Scott did.
For that last caller, that student is writing the paper, this program is going to re-air on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you missed some of the earlier part, we did in earlier segments talk about that relationship. So tune in again on Friday. This will be on again. You might be able to pick up a little bit more from that. And because we got a call from that student, we'd like to remind you that one of the reasons we're doing this is for students and teachers. And if you are an educator, there are several places you can go for more information, and we invite you to call for this information that we have. Again, this is just for teachers and educators on the web. It's cspan.org/classroom. But you can also call 202-626-4858. And before coming out here, I checked with our education department. They're not in today on the holiday, but there is a message machine. So if you'd like to call even today at 202-626-4858, for educators, they'll be able to get back to you later this week for the education kit that we have not only on Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, but all 41 of our segments that we'll be doing between now and December. Macon, Georgia, good morning.
Good morning. My name is James Taylor, and I'm 14 years old also. And I was wondering about the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty signed by the United States and Great Britain in 1850 that gave both countries an equal share in the protection of the canal to be built through Central America. As you know, both countries agreed to maintain the neutrality of the canal and the land on either side of it. And it was named for Zachary Taylor's Secretary of State, John M. Clayton, and the Britain Minister to the United States, Henry Bulwer. It became an unpopular treaty in the United States, and it was later replaced by the 1901 Hay, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Ponce-Fote Treaty, and it granted the United States the right to build and manage the canal. And I was wondering how Zachary Taylor feel about the canal, and what do you think about the United States building a canal? I'll hang up and thank you.
Dr. Rising, is that something you can address?
In my opinion, he single-handedly got California in as a free state. And the next problem was transportation toward California. And we needed a canal to connect the whole country. And the Nicaragua was really a better site than Panama. And yes, they had even let the contracts out to the engineers to dig that canal. Taylor signed the ratification papers the day after he became ill, and then it just became a political football, and nothing ever happened with it. It was one of those turnarounds that I talked about, a 180-degree turnaround. I think if he had lived, we would have seen a canal in Nicaragua. But that was one of the mysteries, I think, of his death.
Moravia, New York is our next call. Good morning.
Good morning. Moravia, New York is where Millard Fillmore was born, and Seward is from Auburn, New York, which is only about 20 miles away. And you were talking about Taylor and Seward, and then Fillmore and Seward. Now, wouldn't Fillmore and Seward have known each other and been friendly before Taylor became president and Fillmore became vice president?
Dr. Smith.
Well, they were very friendly on the surface and very unfriendly, in fact, in that, particularly in that they were rivals. And Seward very much wanted to be president and never made it. And each one wanted to be the head of the Whig Party in New York. And Fillmore had Western New York and Buffalo, and Seward had the other end of it. And there was a great competition between them as to who would get the jobs. Seward actually got an enemy of Fillmore appointed collector of the Port of Buffalo. So that for a long time, Seward really was on the outside. I mean, Fillmore was on the outside looking in his own administration because of Seward's influence. And to Fillmore's credit, when Taylor died, Weed and Seward expected to be a lot of changes. They thought Fillmore's president, now he'll get even. He'll fire our people and hire his own. Fillmore didn't do this. Fillmore dealt with appointments far more on the basis of merit than Seward had, and he made it known he was not going to try to get even with Seward and behave very honorably in this situation. But that's a very common situation in this country for two leaders in the same party to be competing for the leadership of the party in their own particular state, in their own particular bailiwick, and that's what happened there.
Let me ask you both a little bit about him personally. In social situations, would he have been easy to talk to? Is he friendly?
I think so. I think so. I think he was more like Omar Bradley. He was a soldier, and a family man, and great with his children. I think he would. Yeah.
Approachable?
Sure. He loved to get up early in the morning and put on old clothes and usually would not be recognized and go wandering down to Washington, these open-air food stalls. You know, he'd stop and eat an apple or a raw carrot or something and talk to people.
They said he fought the Battle of Monterey sitting sideways on old Whitey with an old straw hat on his head that they picked up a few bullet holes.
Sure.
While he did that.
You suggested earlier that...
I think I very much enjoyed having him for a neighbor.
If you both had the chance to visit with him, what would you want to talk about? Dr. Rising?
I think I would like to talk to him about the fugitive slave law, which I consider to be the pathway to the Civil War. It was part of Clay's compromise. It nullified habeas corpus. It nullified trial by jury. It set up bounties. It created bounty hunters in Kentucky. In this state, sometimes they would kidnap people who weren't even slaves and haul them over to Ohio and get $10 a head for them. And this fugitive slave law, I think, was really the pathway to the Civil War. And I think he would have been very much against that. He would have never passed if he'd lived.
What would you like to talk to him about?
I think he would have signed it. And nobody was pointing out or arguing for its unconstitutionality at that point. Daniel Webster was for it.
It's unconstitutional to have to nullify habeas corpus.
Well, I'm not saying it wasn't unconstitutional. I'm saying that nobody questioned its constitutionality at the time.
Well, they weren't very bright.
And it was a silly law, and it got violated far more often than it got followed. I don't think it was personally that important in bringing on the war, but
I think it inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin quite a bit.
Taylor, after all, it was the only thing the South got out of the compromise. You know, California came in free, New Mexico came in free, the slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia. The only thing that the Southerners could go home and say we got out of this compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act. And Dr. Rising may be correct. He might have vetoed it, but I doubt it.
DeKalb, Illinois. Good morning.
Yes, hello. I appreciate your program. I appreciate Dr. Rising's comments regarding the potential death of Harrison and Taylor. In fact, I was intrigued by a book I found at the University of Virginia, written contemporary with Harrison, published shortly after his death, in which it says it was common understanding that he was poisoned. My question is that I understand the conversations you had regarding slavery, but the fact that both of them coming from the same political party, would there have been other issues that could have, inspired such actions? Jackson was definitely against the bank. There were differences of opinion concerning states. Would there have been other issues that Miller could have picked up on and used as a motivation?
I doubt it. I think that when Harrison was nominated, he did not receive one Southern vote. They got Tyler in as vice president. In those days, you didn't choose your running mate. He was nominated at the convention, so you could get somebody that was 180 degrees away from your thoughts. And Tyler was a Virginia slave owner and planter in that. You remember Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. Harrison was a general in the War of 1812, very similar to Taylor. And I don't know, I think that same history is a continuum. You have the Missouri Compromise of 1820 drawing the line 3630, where above the line there would be no slaves, and south of the line there would be. And then there's the Compromise of 1850. And then 1854 you had the Nebraska-Kansas Act, which said popular sovereignty, that the people in the state could vote one way or another. So people were shipped in there to vote, and that was the first bloodshed of the Civil War, really, in Kansas. So I think it was very similar. I don't think that Jackson and the bank had much to do with it, at least to my knowledge. They didn't.
Asheville, New York. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. The oral history of my family relates me to Zachary Taylor. And earlier there had been some talk about the genealogy, and I was curious as to what would be the best book to get for me to familiarize myself with that, as well as to how I could go about getting in touch with the more direct descendants. Apparently, there's a society or organization there, on the tree.
Burke's Presidential Families is the best source for these descendants. And when I was trying to find the nearest living relative, I wrote every source that I could, every address, name I could find. I had a letter from a young woman in Rome, Italy, Simonetta Castiglione, who was one of the descendants. She wrote on blue paper, was a looping hand, and said she thought that Zachary would be delighted to be exhumed, she said. But no, I got in touch with quite a few of them. Now, Anne, the oldest daughter, who married Dr. Wood, who was Army surgeon and doctor for President Taylor, went to Canada, and there were a lot of Taylors in the mounted police, but I couldn't find their addresses. But it was an interesting journey to find those descendants and talk with some of them. And 3 of the direct descendants were at the exhumation. 3 young women in their 20s, 2 sisters and a cousin, 2 from North Carolina, 1 from Chicago. They were at the exhumation.
For that viewer, what advice would you have besides your book? Where should he look for more information about Zachary Taylor?
I cannot improve over the answer he's already had.
In that case, the next call is from Boulder, Colorado. Good morning.
Good morning. I am from Louisville, Kentucky originally, and I know that the Taylor's land was near the land of the family of George Rogers Clark and William Clark's sister Lucy and her husband Croghan, and I wondered what relationship the Taylors and the Crogans might have had with one another, and I'll hang up and listen for your answer.
Thanks for the call.
I have no knowledge of any relationship, any blood relationship between those families. They were all friendly, but that's all I know.
I can't add anything.
We are at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. If you look on the map, you see the cemetery is in the northeast part of the town, not too far off of Interstate 71. Our next call is from right here in Louisville. Good morning.
Yes, my name's John Galvin. I'm calling from Louisville, and incidentally, I'd like to let your viewers know, as a native Kentuckian, President Taylor is one of the best kept secrets in our state. Very few people know that he's buried here, that he moved here at 3 and was President of the United States. That's probably part of the legacy, I think, of Kentucky's underspending on education. But anyway, my question to Dr. Smith, a comment he made earlier about, and this is why I'm calling, really, 8 of the first 12 presidents owned slaves. Is that what he said? And,
yes.
And he seemed, I think, maybe to project the fact that these are maybe 20th century values projecting on 19th century, maybe a few 18th century presidents. But yet, aren't there values that are timeless? I mean, cannot a good man in any century realize that the buying and selling of human beings is wrong? I mean, weren't there people, in biblical times, that knew that was wrong. And so should we not put that judgment against our presidents and realize that those 8 men were wrong? And it's not the fact that they were reflecting the values of their culture, but they were reflecting a flawed value that they could have realized and spoken out against slavery, like Adams. You mentioned the Adams. And so anyway, that's my comment, and I would like to hear Dr. Smith respond. Thanks.
Well, it was a lot easier for Adams to speak out against slavery in Boston than it was for, say, Taylor in Kentucky. First place, Taylor never sold any slaves, and he felt when he bought them he was improving their lot. I can only say that the human race is a deeply flawed species, and under the circumstances of the early 19th century, not many Americans overcame it. The abolitionists were very, very unpopular. They didn't have much influence. They had far more influence on the South than they did the North, because they hurt the Southern conscience to the point where the Southerner felt that he was being dishonored by the election of a president. Well, Abraham Lincoln, for example, said, "I'll never touch slavery where it exists. I hope it'll disappear in 100 years." But it's wrong. The South seceded because Lincoln said the South said slavery was wrong. They did not want to live in a country where they would not be part of a country where they were being condemned for being unchristian, un-American, undemocratic, and so on. In fact, this whole controversy over the expansion of slavery, the South finally seceded because they couldn't get the federal government to enforce slavery on territories that didn't want it, and these territories were North and South Dakota, Wyoming, places where slavery couldn't have gone anyhow. The South had tolerance for slavery, and you can say that's wrong, but most Americans, the overwhelming majority of Americans, tolerated slavery. The South had tolerance for slavery. They wanted approval. And in reverse, if they couldn't have the right to do something they didn't want to do anyhow, that was a moral condemnation. And that they wouldn't take. You know, dueling was still the custom in the South. If someone impugned your honor or said something bad about you, why, you proved he was wrong by shooting him. In some ways, the secession and the Civil War was a form of that. But to come back to the moral judgments, what kind of moral judgments we make about these men, each individual has to make up his own mind about that. Obviously, slavery was wrong, and yet it was much more complicated. You know, what is going to happen? The non-slave holders, for example, were almost to a man arch racists. Only 20% of the Southern people had anything to do with slavery. But the non-slave holders were ready to fight to preserve it, to keep the black man in his place. We know now that's wrong. It was wrong then, it's wrong now. But again, if you're a slaveholder, what's going to happen to your slaves if you do free them? You're born to them, you inherit them, and where are they going to go? Who's going to look after them? What's going to happen? And if you use the institution in a humane way, as Taylor did, Taylor did not feel that he was being a sinner for having slave labor.
Dr. Rice.
I agree with everything he said, but I think we're missing a crucial point here, and that is the bottom line is always money. And in those days, you funded the federal government with the tariff. So if you were a slave state, you were against the tariff because you sold about 7/8 of your cotton to England. If you were a free state, you were for the tariff to protect the textile industry of New England. So it wasn't that. In fact, when they were squabbling over New Mexico, I think there were 7 black men in New Mexico, 4 of them owned by Army officers. You couldn't grow cotton there anyway. So it wasn't slavery. It was whether that territory would come in as a state, free or slave, and vote for the tariff or against the tariff. And the census of 1860, 95% of Southerners did not own a slave. Only 1%, only 5% owned slaves. 1% owned 100 or more, 2% owned 50 or more, went down from there. So we're dealing here with an economy that's like a corporate power. It's like the cotton plantations in the Mississippi Delta were similar to Boeing or IBM or something. I mean, so if we don't know anything from history, is that if we could learn something from it, that these powerful forces that the average man doesn't really even understand. I think the slavery question was the froth of the matter, but deep down the real current was this: the money is power.
I know we're short on time. Let me get a couple of calls, and we'll have time to come back. Let me ask you to hold, because we're going to take Miami. Miami, good morning.
Yes, good morning. My wife and I both love the program. I have a comment and I have a question. The comment, I'd like to give Zachary Taylor's younger brother, Joseph P. Taylor, is due. A few callers back, someone asked if he had a younger brother who was in the Union Army. He indeed did. Joseph P. Taylor was a veteran of the War of 1812. He was born in Springfield, and he was the commissary general of the Union Army during at least a portion of the Civil War. My question is, Richard Taylor, Zachary Taylor's father, was an officer in the Continental Army, and I was wondering if there are any member of the family that's still a member of the Society of Cincinnati, which Richard Taylor was an original member of. Thank you.
I have no idea. Sorry, I can't answer that. Can you, Clara?
That'd be interesting to investigate. It sounds logical.
I want to say something about the tariff.
Quickly.
In 1833, it was greatly lowered. In 1846, it was abolished. And it was not even an issue in the 1850s, not a significant issue. The South had its own way on every single economic issue right down to the Civil War. If anybody was going to secede over economic reasons, it should have been the North. The South killed the bank, they killed the tariff, they got homesteads vetoed, you name it. And in spite of this, the country was never more prosperous than it was at the point when the South seceded.
LaGrange, Georgia, good morning. Georgia?
LaGrange, Oregon.
I'm sorry, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if your guest knew anything about Zachary Taylor's descendants that moved west to Oregon.
Well, Ann Wood's descendants went to Canada. That's the only connection I have with the Northwest.
Let me close by asking, we talked earlier about the exhumation, the studies that were done on the president's remains.
Right.
What was the outcome, and what do you make of all that now?
Well, the outcome was that there was not enough arsenic residue. However, and I realize that the case is closed. I have some most of the case is now closed. However, the AFIP, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, wrote me a letter not too long ago saying that Taylor lived only 5 days after he became ill, and to their knowledge, no time studies had ever been done on hard metal toxins. The time needed to deposit the toxin in the hair, so that he may have not lived long enough for that to have happened. I'll leave that to the scientists to squabble over.
Dr. Clara Rising, we are thanking you for your time, so we're going to let you go now. Dr. Smith will stay with us for a few more minutes, about another 15, 20 minutes in the program this morning. One of the things we've been doing in each of these segments is talking to a student or teacher at a school that's named for the president that we're focusing on this week. And on the line with us right now is Philip Mendoza. He's a 5th grade student at the Taylor Magnet Elementary School in Stockton, California. Mr. Mendoza, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Fine.
What can you tell us about what you know about Zachary Taylor, who your school is named after?
The war Taylor was willing to face came 11 years later, and his son Richard was a general. He was born in Virginia of 1784. He was taken as an infant to Kentucky and raised on a plantation. He was taken as an infant to Kentucky and raised on a plantation.
Do you know why your school is named for him?
At the time, the schools that were built, they were named after presidents.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know.
Now, do you study history in your 5th grade class?
Yeah.
Do you study about the presidents?
Yeah.
And what do your friends know about Zachary Taylor? Do you think they know very much about him?
Yeah.
And how many students are there in your school?
1,300.
1,300?
Yeah.
In your elementary school. And where are you calling us from this morning?
My teacher's house.
And who's your teacher?
Miss Coates.
Miss Coates, tell us why you're at her house this morning.
To have breakfast with a president.
How many people are there having breakfast?
10.
10?
Yeah.
What are you having?
Pancakes and strawberries.
Now, have you been watching some of our program this morning?
Yeah.
Do you have any question about Zachary Taylor for Dr. Smith?
Yeah. How come his daughter's name was Betty Taylor Bliss and his wife's name was Margaret Peggy Smith and Zachary's last name was Taylor?
Well, his wife was Margaret Smith before she married Taylor, and his daughter was named Taylor before she married Bliss.
Philip Mendoza is a 5th grade student at the Taylor Magnet Elementary School in Stockton, California, with about 10 of his friends at Miss Coates' house this morning having breakfast with the president. Philip Mendoza, thank you very much for taking a few minutes for us this morning to tell us about your school named for Zachary Taylor.
Bliss, incidentally, was very popular in the family. His nickname was Heavenly Bliss.
Thanks, Philip. We appreciate you joining us from Miss Coates' house. Philip Mendoza asked about the daughter and also Margaret Taylor. Tell us a little bit about the role that Zachary Taylor's wife played. We talked earlier about in the military life, but what role, if any, she had in the campaign and afterwards also in the White House?
Well, they were a very private family. We don't really know what goes on between a husband and wife in their private moments. He loved her dearly, and she loved him dearly. In fact, again, she made them open the casket 3 times so she could take one final look. They loved each other dearly. I think being married to someone you love and who loves you is a tremendous source of contentment. And I think it greatly adds to a person's ability to function efficiently and to function with distinction, as Taylor did. You know, he had no domestic worries. He had a loving relationship. When he went home, he was in a loving family.
But in the White House,
I think that was very important.
She didn't act as First Lady.
Well, she didn't preside over the formal dinners. Now, they did a great deal of entertaining. They had the cabinet over, the cabinet wives, the cabinet's families. They did a great deal of entertaining, which would have put a great strain on her physically if she had been in charge of this. But remember, someone had to plan it. They had a very small staff, as a matter of fact. But somebody had to decide what they're going to eat, who's going to cook it, or when they're going to do this, when they're going to do that. And so Mrs. Taylor turned that role over to her daughter. It doesn't mean she wasn't there, or that she didn't sit at the table alongside her husband. It just meant that she was not in charge of running these things.
We have just a few minutes left. Again, Zachary Taylor, 12th president. Briefly, what did he look like?
Well, he was 5'8". He was beginning to get, he was fairly bald. He had a very rugged face. He was not ugly, but he was certainly not handsome. It was just a strong face, and it was a face that got him the girl he wanted to marry, the only one, so far as we know, he ever loved, and she loved him all his life, and so what else difference did it make, you see? And his looks appealed to the public, too.
You mentioned earlier about him being good-natured and approachable. Did he have a sense of humor?
Oh, yeah. He had a sense of humor. I can't give you any examples of it exactly, but he was a very affable person in his personal.
There are descriptions that he was fairly good with a spittoon.
I suppose he was. A lot of them were. You know, the Capitol had these big spittoons until fairly recently. Practically every senator and congressman chewed tobacco. Whether he chewed or not, I don't know. I would like, if I might, to read the last few lines of his inaugural address, which I think sums up his attitude toward the job and what his job was. He said, "For more than half a century, during which kingdoms and empires have fallen, this Union has stood unshaken. Upon its preservation must depend our own happiness and that of countless generations to come. Whatever dangers may threaten it, I shall stand by it and maintain it in its integrity to the full extent of the obligations imposed and the powers conferred upon me by the Constitution." And as far as he was concerned, the best way to do this was to keep the sections at peace, to deal fairly with each section, and to try to get them to look at the whole situation realistically, which a great many people did not.
In just the few minutes we have left, we'll take a couple of more calls. I know you have in there his final dying words. Let me ask you to look for those while we take a call from Fort Lauderdale. Good morning.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about his conduct of the Seminole War before he became president? Thank you.
Well, he did better than the other 3 or 4 generals who were involved in it. He enlisted Indians to help him find other Indians, and he made promises to them, and he kept these promises. As I said earlier, he tried to use bloodhounds, but he kept muzzles on them so they couldn't bite any Indians, but that was a waste of time. In fact, one senator made a speech against this waste of dog power. They didn't find anybody. He dealt fairly, and he got one group of Indians to surrender with a promise that they could keep the blacks, that the blacks who had, the slaves who had escaped from southern masters and had joined the Indians in Florida could stay with them. And he incurred great criticism in the South because he stood by this. The different people offered claims, and he said these claims were not valid, and at least 400 former slaves went west with the Indians. And then he finally concluded, he was, I think, the last one that made the effort to round up these 1,500 Seminoles, which they never did do. He said, it's time to let the people of Florida fend for themselves. They're not threatening the people of Florida, and they're living their own lives in the Everglades. They're leaving them alone. And then that advice was taken.
Do you have his final words? They're in your sheet somewhere. We saw them earlier. Well, tell you what, while you continue to look, we'll hear from Huntsville, Alabama.
Let me look right quick.
Huntsville, good morning.
Yes, this is Dudley Powell in Huntsville. My wife, Diane, and I are enjoying your program very much. We wanted to comment on Mrs. Rising's discussion of the fugitive slave law. It has always been repugnant to me. I'm a white Southerner, but I objected to that law very much, and would have, and admired very much the people who used civil disobedience and did not obey that law, and furthermore ran the railroad to fight that situation. I'd like Ms. Rising to comment on that law, fugitive slave law.
I tell you, she has left us for now, so let's get the professor's comment.
It was not a good law, but it was very important because in the South in 1850, you had some extensive local elections. You had people running for Congress, the Senate, and governorships. And you had one faction very eager to secede, who were ready to split the Union. They, all kinds of reasons they wanted to secede. And Fillmore rationalized his signing of the Fugitive Slave Act with the idea, which was communicated to him by the moderate Southerners. The moderate Southerners, in effect, begged Fillmore to sign this act because, in effect, if he did not, they would lose the election to the radical Southerners. And it was the only thing that the South got out of the compromise. And so Fillmore himself said that he walked the floor, he worried a great deal about it, and I think Taylor might have too. But I think Taylor would have signed it, and Fillmore did sign it, because as a result of his signing it, the moderate Southerners won most of the elections in the South in 1850. And that's what was at stake surrounding this one bill. The only thing the South was going to get, and it would have very much played into the hands of the Southern radicals who were trying to displace the Southern moderates in power in the South if that bill had been vetoed.
At the back of this national cemetery is a monument to the 12th President Zachary Taylor, and carved on it are what are believed to be his dying words, and they are, "I have endeavored to do my duty. I am ready to die. My only regret is for the friends I leave behind me." Dr. Smith, what do those words tell you about the man?
Well, they tell you he was a very brave man who felt that he had accomplished all that he might have expected to when he was born, and was very sad. He was still sympathizing with his family and friends for the pain that they were going to be caused. Did you want me to read it again?
Well, I tell you, let's get it. Just a couple of minutes left. Since we saw it, we're going to hear from Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
Good morning.
Hi. I was curious to know if Zachary Taylor was a Christian. Some of the things that he has said this morning may, to me, allude to this. Maybe he was a Christian, the way he treated his slaves, the way he honored his word. When he gave it, he kept it. Was he a Christian, and did he belong to any particular Christian churches at that time?
Well, he was brought up in the Episcopal Church. Out on the frontier, you didn't have churches. I haven't really seen any evidence one way or the other of his participation in church activities. On the other hand, he, as you have said, he acted very much like a Christian.
We have a little less than...
And I'm quite sure his wife was. And that's the best we can do on it. If he wasn't a Christian, then not many people are.
We have about a minute left. Your book is entitled The Presidencies of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. That's our next stop. Very briefly, what will we hear about when we hear about Millard Fillmore?
Well, I don't know. He has been controversial also. So I don't know what the person who will be talking about Fillmore will have to say. In my opinion, Fillmore was a very honorable man and did a very good job. He picked up where Taylor left off. He did not reverse any of Taylor's policies. Taylor was going to protect New Mexico. Fillmore immediately sent 1,500 extra troops to protect New Mexico. He announced publicly that he would protect New Mexico, and it was at that point that the South threw in the towel and agreed for Texas to accept some $20 million in payment of their bonds in exchange for giving up their claim to New Mexico.
Dr. Albert Smith is also Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland. Thank you very much for traveling from Maryland to be with us here in Louisville today at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery, our 12th stop. Our 13th stop, Friday, June 11th in East Aurora, New York at the Fillmore House Museum. We'll be talking about the 13th president, the man who succeeded Zachary Taylor when he died. Zachary Taylor, the second president to die in office just 9 years after William Henry Harrison, succeeded by Millard Fillmore. Again, our thanks to the staff here at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery. Also our thanks to Intermedia Cable, the local cable company which carries C-SPAN. And we thank our guests and also Eric Hansen and his crew for all of the work that they've done putting up this television studio in the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery. Thank you all for being with us, and have a great rest of your Memorial Day 1999.
Coming up, a look at our American President series with University